Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The manila envelope arrived at the Harvard Medical School archives on a rain-soaked Tuesday in November 1973, bearing no return address and postmarked from a small Vermont town whose name had been deliberately smudged beyond recognition. Inside, Professor Daniel Cartwright discovered a collection of documents that would challenge everything he believed about human psychology and community dynamics in post-war America. The papers consisted of medical records, handwritten testimonies, and what appeared to be official correspondence from a psychiatric facility that, according to the letterhead, had operated under the name Millbrook Rehabilitation Center between 1946 and 1952. The facility's location was listed as somewhere in the remote valleys of northern Vermont, though subsequent investigations would reveal no trace of such an institution in any official records. Dr. Cartwright, a specialist in abnormal psychology who had spent decades studying cult behavior and mass hysteria, initially dismissed the documents as elaborate fiction. The accounts they contained seemed too bizarre, too methodically documented to represent genuine case studies, yet the paper bore authentic aging. The typewriter fonts matched those used in the late 1940s, and the medical terminology employed throughout the reports demonstrated a sophistication that suggested genuine psychiatric expertise. The central figure in these documents was identified only as Patient Zero, a woman whose arrival in the unnamed community had apparently triggered a series of events that would ultimately consume an entire population of approximately 300 souls. According to the intake records, she had been transferred to Millbrook from a state hospital in Massachusetts, diagnosed with what the attending physician termed acute moral dissociation disorder, a classification that appeared nowhere in contemporary psychiatric literature. The woman's background remained deliberately obscured throughout the documentation. References to her past were limited to cryptic notations about wartime trauma and exposure to systematic dehumanization protocols. What emerged clearly from the records was that she possessed an unusual ability to influence the behavior of others through what the facility's director, Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, described as psychological contagion of unprecedented virulence. The community where these events unfolded was described as a typical New England settlement, populated primarily by families who had lived in the region for generations. The residents were characterized as deeply religious, socially conservative, and bound together by traditions that stretched back to the area's founding in the early 18th century. They maintained strict moral codes, particularly regarding matters of sexuality and personal conduct, viewing any deviation from established norms as threats to their collective spiritual welfare. Patient Zero's integration into this environment had been part of an experimental rehabilitation program designed to reintroduce institutionalized individuals into society through carefully monitored community placement. The theory, progressive for its time, suggested that exposure to stable social structures would accelerate psychological healing and reduce recidivism rates among former patients. The initial reports documented a period of apparent success. Patient Zero, housed with a local family and assigned light domestic duties, seemed to adapt well to her new environment. Community members noted her quiet demeanor, her diligent work ethic, and her apparent eagerness to conform to local customs. The supervising psychiatrist's weekly evaluations recorded steady improvement in her condition, with particular emphasis on her growing ability to form appropriate social connections. However, subtle changes began manifesting within the community approximately 6 weeks after Patient Zero's arrival. The first documented incidents involved minor behavioral anomalies among the younger residents, unexplained absences from religious services, reports of strange gatherings in the surrounding forests, and whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when adults approached. Dr. Blackthorne's notes from this period revealed growing concern about what he termed behavioral synchronization patterns emerging among the community members. His observations suggested that individuals were beginning to mirror patient Zero's mannerisms and speech patterns, despite having minimal direct contact with her. More troubling were reports of shared dreams and collective experiences that seemed to transcend normal psychological boundaries. The medical records indicated that Dr. Blackthorne had begun implementing additional monitoring protocols, including regular psychological evaluations of community members and detailed documentation of all social interactions involving patient Zero. His methodology appeared rigorous, employing standardized assessment tools and maintaining careful statistical analysis of behavioral changes across the population. Yet, even as the documentation became more comprehensive, the events it described grew increasingly difficult to categorize within conventional psychiatric frameworks. The community's transformation seemed to follow patterns that defied traditional understanding of group psychology, suggesting influences that operated beyond the scope of recognized therapeutic or pathological processes. As Professor Cartwright examined these initial reports, he found himself confronting questions that would haunt his research for years to come. What forces had truly been unleashed in that remote Vermont community? And why had all official records of its existence been so thoroughly erased? Dr. Blackthorne's records from the third month of patient Zero's residency revealed a disturbing escalation in what he had begun to classify as collective behavioral aberrations. The community's transformation had progressed beyond mere mimicry into something far more profound and unsettling. His clinical observations, meticulously documented in a leather-bound journal discovered among the papers, painted a picture of psychological contagion unlike anything recorded in contemporary literature. The first significant incident occurred during the community's weekly religious gathering. According to witness statements collected by Dr. Blackthorne, the congregation had assembled for their customary Sunday service when several members began exhibiting synchronized physical responses that bore no relation to the liturgical proceedings. The affected individuals, ranging in age from adolescence to middle years, demonstrated identical patterns of trembling, perspiration, and what the attending minister described as expressions of profound spiritual anguish. What distinguished this event from typical religious enthusiasm was its mechanical precision. The affected community members moved in perfect unison, their breathing synchronized, their facial expressions mirroring one another with uncanny accuracy. Patient Zero, seated in the rear of the chapel, remained motionless throughout the episode. Yet multiple witnesses reported sensing an invisible connection between her presence and the congregation's distress. Dr. Blackthorne's analysis of this incident revealed patterns that challenged conventional understanding of group psychology. His measurements of the affected individual's vital signs showed remarkable uniformity. Heart rates, respiratory patterns, and even skin temperature readings displayed variations of less than 2% across the entire group. Such physiological synchronization, he noted, typically required extensive conditioning or pharmaceutical intervention to achieve. The community's leadership initially attributed these manifestations to spiritual awakening, interpreting the synchronized responses as evidence of divine intervention. The local minister, Reverend Josiah Crane, proclaimed the events as signs of approaching revelation, encouraging his congregation to embrace what he termed the purification of collective consciousness. This interpretation would prove catastrophically misguided as subsequent events unfolded. Patient Zero's host family, the Weatherbys, provided Dr. Blackthorne with detailed accounts of her behavior during this period. Their observations revealed subtle but significant changes in her daily routines. She had begun spending extended periods in meditation-like states, often remaining motionless for hours while maintaining an expression of intense concentration. During these episodes, family members reported experiencing vivid dreams that seemed to originate from outside their own consciousness. The content of these shared dreams followed disturbing patterns. Multiple community members described identical visions involving ritualistic gatherings in locations that bore no resemblance to their familiar surroundings. The dream scenarios invariably featured acts of collective penance, with participants engaging in behaviors that violated their deeply held moral convictions while experiencing profound spiritual ecstasy. Dr. Blackthorne's psychiatric evaluation of these reports led him to hypothesize that patient zero possessed an unusual capacity for what he termed psychic broadcasting. His theory suggested that her traumatic experiences had somehow enhanced her ability to project psychological states onto receptive individuals, creating a form of mental contagion that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The doctor's research into patient zero's background revealed fragments of her wartime experiences that provided context for her unusual condition. Military medical records, heavily redacted but still partially legible, indicated her exposure to experimental psychological techniques employed by enemy forces. The document suggested she had been subjected to systematic conditioning designed to break down individual identity and replace it with collective consciousness patterns. These revelations prompted Dr. Blackthorne to implement more stringent monitoring protocols. He established a network of observers throughout the community, training selected residents to document behavioral anomalies and report unusual incidents. His methodology involved careful statistical analysis of social interactions, mapping the spread of synchronized behaviors across family and social groups. The data collected during this period revealed alarming trends. The behavioral synchronization was expanding beyond the initial group of affected individuals, spreading through the community according to patterns that resembled viral transmission. Dr. Blackthorne's charts showed clear correlation between proximity to patient zero and the onset of synchronized behaviors, yet the mechanism of transmission remained mysteriously elusive. Most disturbing were the reports of nocturnal gatherings that began occurring with increasing frequency. Community members, apparently acting under some form of collective compulsion, would leave their homes during the darkest hours and converge at predetermined locations in the surrounding wilderness. These assemblies followed ritualistic patterns that bore no resemblance to any known religious or cultural traditions. The participants in these gatherings retained no conscious memory of their activities, awakening in their beds with no awareness of their nocturnal excursions. Only physical evidence, muddy clothing, unexplained injuries, and strange markings on their bodies provided proof of their participation in events that defied rational explanation. Dr. Blackthorne's growing alarm was evident in his increasingly urgent correspondence with his superiors at the State Medical Board. His requests for additional resources and emergency intervention protocols suggested a man confronting phenomena that exceeded his professional expertise and threatened to overwhelm his ability to maintain scientific objectivity in the face of inexplicable human behavior. The transformation of the community's moral framework began with what Dr. Blackthorne documented as the emergence of spontaneous theological innovation. His records from the 4th month revealed that Reverend Crane had begun incorporating unprecedented interpretations into his sermons, drawing upon concepts that appeared to have no basis in traditional Christian doctrine. These new teachings centered around the notion that individual sin could only be purged through collective suffering, and that the community's spiritual salvation required the participation of every member in acts of mutual penance. The theological shift coincided with Patient Zero's integration into the community's religious activities. Though she maintained her characteristic silence during services, her presence seemed to catalyze profound changes in the congregation's spiritual understanding. Dr. Blackthorne's observations noted that Reverend Crane's sermons had become increasingly focused on themes of shared guilt, communal responsibility, and the necessity of physical manifestation of spiritual cleansing. The minister's personal journals, discovered among the archived materials, revealed the internal struggle of a man grappling with revelations that challenged his lifelong beliefs. His entries described vivid dreams in which he received divine instructions regarding new forms of worship that would purify the community through collective sacrifice. These visions, he wrote, came with such clarity and authority that he felt compelled to implement them despite their radical departure from established religious practice. The first formal implementation of these new doctrines occurred during what became known as the Night of Shared Burden. Community members gathered in the chapel for what they believed would be a traditional prayer service, only to find themselves participating in rituals that bore little resemblance to conventional worship. Dr. Blackthorne's detailed account, based on testimonies collected afterward, described a ceremony in which participants engaged in acts of mutual confession that transcended normal boundaries of privacy and personal dignity. The psychological impact of these gatherings was profound and immediate. Community members reported experiencing intense emotional catharsis, describing sensations of spiritual liberation that surpassed anything they had previously encountered in traditional religious practice. Yet this euphoria came at a significant cost, as the ceremonies required participants to abandon fundamental concepts of individual autonomy and personal boundaries. Dr. Blackthorne's clinical analysis of the affected individuals revealed concerning patterns of psychological dependency. The participants displayed symptoms consistent with what he termed induced dissociative states, characterized by diminished capacity for independent decision-making and increased susceptibility to group influence. Their psychological profiles showed marked changes in personality structure, with traditional moral frameworks being replaced by new ethical systems that prioritized collective needs over individual welfare. The community's social hierarchy underwent radical restructuring during this period. Traditional authority figures found their influence diminished as new forms of leadership emerged based on perceived spiritual sensitivity rather than established social position. Patient Zero, despite maintaining her outward passivity, had become the unofficial focal point of these changes, with community members seeking her proximity as if her presence validated their spiritual experiences. The Weatherby family's detailed observations provided insight into Patient Zero's role in these developments. Their reports described subtle changes in her behavior that suggested growing awareness of her influence over the community. She had begun positioning herself strategically during gatherings, moving to locations where her presence would have maximum psychological impact on the assembled participants. Her actions appeared calculated, yet she maintained the appearance of unconscious participation in the unfolding events. Dr. Blackthorne's correspondence with external medical authorities during this period revealed his growing concern about the community's psychological trajectory. His letters described phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of group dynamics and religious behavior. The synchronized responses he had initially documented had evolved into something far more complex, a form of collective consciousness that seemed to operate according to principles unknown to contemporary psychology. The doctor's attempts to intervene through traditional therapeutic methods proved ineffective. Individual counseling sessions with affected community members yielded little insight, as participants displayed remarkable consistency in their accounts of spiritual transformation. They described their experiences in language that suggested genuine religious conviction, yet the content of their beliefs bore disturbing similarities to the conditioning techniques Dr. Blackthorne had identified in patient Zero's military medical records. Most troubling was the emergence of what the community had begun to term purification protocols. These practices, which developed organically from the initial religious gatherings, involved increasingly elaborate rituals designed to cleanse participants of individual desires and replace them with collective purpose. The protocols required participants to engage in acts that violated their previous moral convictions, while maintaining that such violations were necessary for spiritual advancement. The community's isolation from external influence facilitated the rapid development of these practices. Geographic remoteness, combined with the residents' traditional suspicion of outside interference, created an environment where radical behavioral changes could occur without external scrutiny. Dr. Blackthorne found himself in the unique position of being the only outside observer with access to document the community's transformation. His clinical notes from this period reflected a man struggling to maintain scientific objectivity while witnessing phenomena that defied rational explanation. The community's evolution toward collective behavioral modification represented something unprecedented in psychiatric literature. Yet the mechanisms driving these changes remained frustratingly elusive, despite his methodical documentation efforts. Dr. Blackthorne's records from the fifth month documented the systematic dismantling of the community's traditional moral boundaries through what he termed progressive desensitization protocols. The transformation had reached a critical threshold where individual conscience was being systematically replaced by collective moral reasoning that operated according to principles entirely foreign to conventional ethical frameworks. The process began with subtle modifications to the community's daily routines. Traditional family structures, which had previously governed social interaction and moral instruction, were gradually reorganized around new principles of collective responsibility. Children were separated from their parents during designated periods and placed under the guidance of community elders who had been most profoundly affected by patient Zero's influence. These arrangements were presented as temporary educational measures designed to enhance spiritual development. The educational curriculum implemented during these sessions bore little resemblance to conventional moral instruction. Dr. Blackthorne's covert observations revealed that children were being taught to view individual desires and personal boundaries as obstacles to spiritual enlightenment. The lessons emphasized the necessity of surrendering personal autonomy to achieve higher states of consciousness, using techniques that systematically undermined the psychological foundations of individual identity. Patient Zero's role in these developments had evolved from passive catalyst to active participant. The Weatherby family reported that she had begun conducting private sessions with selected community members, during which she employed methods that appeared to combine elements of hypnosis, religious instruction, and psychological conditioning. These sessions invariably resulted in profound behavioral changes among participants who emerged with altered perspectives on fundamental moral questions. The content of these private sessions remained largely mysterious, as participants retained limited conscious memory of their experiences. However, Dr. Blackthorne's careful documentation of behavioral changes before and after these encounters revealed consistent patterns. Individuals who had previously demonstrated strong adherence to traditional moral principles began exhibiting increasing tolerance for behaviors they had once considered abhorrent. The community's religious practices underwent corresponding transformations during this period. Reverend Crane's sermons had evolved into elaborate justifications for moral flexibility, arguing that rigid adherence to conventional ethics represented a form of spiritual pride that prevented true enlightenment. His theological innovations drew upon obscure religious texts and esoteric interpretations that provided intellectual framework for the community's behavioral evolution. Dr. Blackthorne's analysis of these theological developments revealed sophisticated psychological manipulation disguised as spiritual instruction. The minister's arguments followed patterns consistent with advanced conditioning techniques, systematically breaking down moral resistance through logical frameworks that appeared reasonable while leading to conclusions that violated fundamental ethical principles. The physical environment of the community was also being modified to support these psychological changes. Traditional symbols of moral authority, religious artifacts, family portraits, and community monuments were gradually replaced with new imagery that reinforced the emerging collective identity. These changes occurred so gradually that most residents remained unaware of the systematic alteration of their cultural landscape. The most disturbing aspect of this transformation was its apparent voluntariness. Community members participated enthusiastically in their own moral reconditioning, viewing each step in the process as evidence of spiritual advancement. Dr. Blackthorne's psychological evaluations revealed that participants genuinely believed they were achieving higher states of consciousness through their abandonment of traditional moral constraints. The doctor's attempts to document these changes faced increasing obstacles as the community became more insular and suspicious of external observation. His presence, once welcomed as part of Patient Zero's therapeutic program, was now viewed with growing hostility by community members who perceived his scientific methodology as incompatible with their spiritual evolution. Patient Zero's influence had become so pervasive that Dr. Blackthorne found it increasingly difficult to identify aspects of community life that remained unaffected by her presence. Her psychological fingerprints could be detected in every significant social interaction, every policy decision, and every modification to traditional practices. Yet she maintained her characteristic appearance of passive participation, creating the illusion that the community's transformation was occurring through organic spiritual development rather than external manipulation. The doctor's correspondence with his superiors during this period reflected growing desperation as he struggled to convey the severity of the situation through conventional psychiatric terminology. The phenomena he was witnessing defied standard diagnostic categories, requiring him to develop new theoretical frameworks to explain the systematic dissolution of individual moral agency within a functioning social structure. His reports described a community in the process of complete psychological reconstruction, where traditional concepts of right and wrong were being replaced by new ethical systems that prioritized collective harmony over individual conscience. The implications of this transformation extended far beyond the immediate community, suggesting possibilities for human behavioral modification that challenged fundamental assumptions about moral development and social organization. Most troubling was Dr. Blackthorne's growing realization that the community's transformation was approaching a point of irreversibility, where the psychological changes would become so deeply embedded that restoration of traditional moral frameworks might prove impossible. The 6th month of Patient Zero's residency marked the emergence of what Dr. Blackthorne classified as institutionalized moral inversion protocols. His documentation revealed that the community had begun implementing systematic practices designed to transform acts of transgression into instruments of spiritual purification. These rituals, which the participants termed sacred corrections, represented the culmination of months of psychological conditioning and moral restructuring. The theoretical foundation for these practices had been established through Reverend Crane's increasingly radical theological interpretations. His sermons now proclaimed that traditional concepts of sin and virtue were artificial constructs that prevented genuine spiritual development. According to his new doctrine, true enlightenment could only be achieved through the deliberate violation of conventional moral boundaries, followed by collective acknowledgement and shared responsibility for these transgressions. Dr. Blackthorn's covert observations of the initial ritualized sessions revealed a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation that combined elements of religious ceremony, group therapy, and behavioral conditioning. The participants gathered in carefully arranged circles, with patient zero positioned at the center despite her apparent lack of formal authority. Her presence seemed to provide psychological validation for activities that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The rituals followed a precise structure that maximized their psychological impact. Participants began each session with collective confession of individual desires and moral failings, creating an atmosphere of shared vulnerability. This was followed by what the community termed corrective demonstrations, during which selected individuals would engage in acts that violated their previous moral convictions, while the group provided encouragement and spiritual justification. The psychological effects of these practices were immediate and profound. Dr. Blackthorn's clinical evaluations revealed that participants experienced intense emotional catharsis during the sessions, describing sensations of liberation from psychological burdens they had carried throughout their lives. The rituals appeared to provide a mechanism for resolving internal moral conflicts by redefining transgression as spiritual advancement. Patient Zero's role in these ceremonies had evolved beyond mere presence to active facilitation. The Weatherby family reported that she had begun demonstrating remarkable insight into individual psychological vulnerabilities, guiding the selection of participants and the specific nature of their corrective demonstrations. Her ability to identify and exploit personal moral conflicts suggested either extraordinary psychological intuition or access to information obtained through unknown means. The community's social structure was being fundamentally reorganized around these ritualized practices. Traditional hierarchies based on age, family status, and moral reputation were replaced by new rankings determined by willingness to participate in increasingly transgressive activities. Those who demonstrated the greatest capacity for moral flexibility achieved elevated status within the community, while individuals who maintained resistance to the new practices found themselves increasingly isolated. Dr. Blackthorn's analysis of this social reorganization revealed patterns consistent with advanced cult indoctrination techniques. The community was systematically rewarding behaviors that violated conventional moral standards while punishing adherence to traditional ethical principles. This created powerful psychological pressure for conformity, as social acceptance became dependent upon participation in activities that contradicted deeply held beliefs. The doctor's attempts to intervene through individual counseling sessions proved not only ineffective, but counterproductive. Community members who had previously cooperated with his research began viewing his therapeutic approach as incompatible with their spiritual development. They described his emphasis on individual psychological health as a form of spiritual selfishness that prevented them from achieving collective enlightenment. The physical manifestations of the community's transformation became increasingly apparent during this period. Participants in the ritualized sessions displayed synchronized physiological responses that suggested profound alterations in neurological function. Dr. Blackthorn's measurements revealed coordinated changes in heart rate, breathing patterns, and brainwave activity that occurred across multiple individuals simultaneously. Most disturbing was the emergence of what Dr. Blackthorn termed collective memory formation. Participants began sharing detailed recollections of events they had not personally witnessed, suggesting that the ritualized practices were creating some form of shared consciousness that transcended individual psychological boundaries. These shared memories invariably involved scenarios that reinforced the community's new moral framework while demonizing traditional ethical systems. The content of these collective memories followed consistent patterns that suggested deliberate construction rather than spontaneous emergence. The scenarios invariably portrayed conventional moral authorities as oppressive forces that prevented spiritual development, while presenting transgressive behaviors as necessary steps toward enlightenment. Dr. Blackthorne recognized these patterns as sophisticated propaganda techniques designed to justify the community's behavioral transformation. Patient Zero's influence had become so pervasive that Dr. Blackthorne found it impossible to identify any aspect of community life that remained unaffected by her presence. Her psychological fingerprints could be detected in every significant decision, every modification to traditional practices, and every step in the community's moral evolution. Yet she maintained her characteristic appearance of passive participation, creating the illusion that the transformation was occurring through organic spiritual development. The doctor's growing alarm was evident in his increasingly urgent correspondence with external authorities. His reports described a community that had achieved complete psychological restructuring within a remarkably short time frame, demonstrating the potential for rapid and comprehensive behavioral modification under specific conditions. The seventh month witnessed the formalization of what Dr. Blackthorne documented as systematic transgression protocols, elaborate frameworks that transformed individual moral failures into community-wide experiences of shared culpability and collective redemption. The practices that had emerged organically from the ritualized sessions were now being codified into a comprehensive system of behavioral modification that governed every aspect of community life. Reverend Crane had begun maintaining detailed records of these protocols, creating what he termed the Manual of Sacred Corrections. This document, discovered among the archived materials, outlined specific procedures for identifying moral transgressions and implementing appropriate collective responses. The manual's language combined traditional religious terminology with psychological concepts that bore striking resemblance to the conditioning techniques found in Patient Zero's military medical records. The community's approach to moral transgression had been completely inverted from conventional frameworks. Individual acts of moral failure were no longer viewed as personal failings requiring private repentance, but as opportunities for collective spiritual advancement through shared participation in corrective experiences. The community had developed elaborate ceremonies designed to distribute responsibility for individual transgressions across the entire population. Dr. Blackthorne's documentation revealed that these ceremonies followed increasingly sophisticated psychological principles. The community had learned to identify specific moral vulnerabilities within individuals and design collective experiences that forced all participants to confront similar psychological conflicts. This approach created powerful bonds of shared culpability while systematically breaking down individual moral resistance. Patient Zero's role in these developments had evolved into something approaching spiritual leadership. Though she maintained her characteristic appearance of passive participation, the Weatherby family reported that she had begun conducting what they termed diagnostic sessions with community members, during which she demonstrated uncanny ability to identify hidden moral conflicts and psychological vulnerabilities. Her insights were then incorporated into the community's collective correction protocols. The psychological impact of these practices extended far beyond the immediate participants. Dr. Blackthorne's observations revealed that the entire community was experiencing profound alterations in moral reasoning and ethical decision-making. Traditional concepts of individual responsibility were being replaced by complex systems of collective accountability that made personal moral autonomy virtually impossible to maintain. The community's children were being systematically integrated into these practices through carefully designed educational programs. Dr. Blackthorn's covert observations of these sessions revealed sophisticated techniques for reshaping moral development from an early age. Children were taught to view individual desires and personal boundaries as obstacles to spiritual growth, while collective participation in transgressive activities was presented as evidence of moral maturity. The physical environment of the community had been completely transformed to support these psychological changes. Traditional symbols of individual achievement and personal virtue had been replaced with imagery that reinforced collective identity and shared responsibility. Even private spaces within homes were being modified to discourage individual reflection and promote group consciousness. Dr. Blackthorn's attempts to document these changes faced increasing resistance from community members who had begun to view his scientific methodology as incompatible with their spiritual development. His presence was now tolerated only because Patient Zero's therapeutic program provided official justification for his continued observation. However, his access to community activities was becoming increasingly restricted. The doctor's psychological evaluations revealed that community members were experiencing profound alterations in personality structure and moral reasoning. Traditional defense mechanisms that protected individual psychological integrity were being systematically dismantled and replaced with collective psychological processes that prioritized group harmony over personal authenticity. Most disturbing was the emergence of what Dr. Blackthorn termed distributed moral agency, a psychological state in which individual community members became incapable of making independent moral decisions without reference to collective consensus. This condition appeared to be irreversible, as affected individuals lost the psychological foundations necessary for autonomous ethical reasoning. The community's isolation from external influence had become complete during this period. Traditional connections to outside institutions, government agencies, religious organizations, and commercial relationships were being systematically severed as the community became increasingly self-contained. This isolation facilitated the rapid implementation of increasingly radical behavioral modifications without external interference. Patient Zero's influence had achieved total penetration of community life, yet her methods remained mysteriously elusive. Dr. Blackthorn's extensive documentation revealed the effects of her presence, but provided little insight into the specific mechanisms through which she achieved such comprehensive psychological control. Her ability to reshape an entire community's moral framework suggested capabilities that exceeded conventional understanding of human psychological influence. The doctor's correspondence with external authorities during this period reflected growing desperation as he struggled to convey the severity of the situation through conventional psychiatric terminology. His reports described phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature, moral development, and the possibilities for behavioral modification within functioning social structures. The community's transformation was approaching what Dr. Blackthorn recognized as a point of no return, where the psychological changes would become so deeply embedded that restoration of traditional moral frameworks would prove impossible. The 8th month marked what Dr. Blackthorn documented as the achievement of complete psychological synthesis, a state in which the community's transformation had reached such profound depths that individual consciousness had become virtually indistinguishable from collective awareness. His final detailed observations revealed a population that had undergone fundamental alterations in human psychological functioning, creating what appeared to be an entirely new form of social organization. The community's daily routines had been completely restructured around the principles of collective moral responsibility. Traditional concepts of privacy, personal autonomy, and individual decision-making had been systematically eliminated and replaced with group processes that governed every aspect of human behavior. Community members moved through their days in carefully choreographed patterns that maximized collective psychological integration while minimizing opportunities for independent thought. Patient Zero's transformation during this period was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire phenomenon. The passive, traumatized individual who had arrived 8 months earlier had evolved into something that defied conventional psychiatric classification. Her influence over the community had become so complete that she appeared to function as a form of collective consciousness made manifest, simultaneously present in every significant decision and interaction, while maintaining her characteristic appearance of detached observation. Dr. Blackthorne's clinical evaluations revealed that patient Zero had achieved what he termed distributed psychological presence, a condition in which her mental processes seemed to operate through multiple individuals simultaneously. Community members displayed synchronized thought patterns, emotional responses, and behavioral choices that suggested they were functioning as extensions of her consciousness rather than as independent psychological entities. The community's approach to moral transgression had reached its ultimate expression through what they termed perfect collective accountability. Individual acts of moral failure were no longer corrected through group participation, but prevented entirely through collective psychological monitoring that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. Community members had developed an uncanny ability to anticipate and prevent moral transgressions before they occurred, creating a state of perpetual moral purity that was maintained through constant psychological vigilance. The children born into this environment displayed psychological characteristics that differed fundamentally from normal human development. Dr. Blackthorne's observations revealed that these individuals exhibited collective consciousness from birth, lacking the psychological foundations necessary for individual identity formation. They demonstrated remarkable emotional stability and social cooperation, but appeared incapable of independent moral reasoning or personal desire formation. The physical manifestations of the community's transformation had become increasingly apparent during this final phase. Community members displayed synchronized physiological responses that suggested profound alterations in neurological function. Their brainwave patterns, measured during Dr. Blackthorne's covert monitoring sessions, showed remarkable uniformity across the entire population, indicating levels of psychological integration that challenged fundamental assumptions about human consciousness. Most disturbing was the emergence of what Dr. Blackthorne termed collective memory integration, a phenomenon in which individual community members possessed detailed recollections of experiences they had never personally encountered. These shared memories created a form of distributed historical consciousness that reinforced the community's collective identity while eliminating personal psychological boundaries. The community's relationship with external reality had been fundamentally altered through these psychological changes. Traditional concepts of objective truth and empirical observation were replaced with collective consensus mechanisms that determined reality through group agreement rather than external verification. This created a closed psychological system that was virtually immune to external influence or contradiction. Dr. Blackthorne's attempts to maintain scientific objectivity became increasingly difficult as he found himself subject to the same psychological influences that had transformed the community. His final journal entries revealed growing uncertainty about his own perceptions and increasing difficulty distinguishing between objective observation and collective psychological influence. The community's transformation had achieved such completeness that even trained observers were susceptible to its effects. The doctor's correspondence with external authorities during this period reflected profound alarm about the implications of what he had witnessed. His reports described the successful creation of a form of human social organization that eliminated individual psychological autonomy while maintaining the appearance of voluntary participation. The community had achieved perfect social harmony through the complete elimination of individual moral agency. Patient Zero's ultimate purpose remained mysteriously elusive despite months of careful observation. Dr. Blackthorne's extensive documentation revealed the comprehensive nature of her influence, but provided little insight into her motivations or the source of her extraordinary capabilities. Her transformation of an entire community suggested possibilities for human behavioral modification that exceeded conventional understanding of psychological influence. The community's evolution had reached what appeared to be its intended conclusion: a stable social system based on collective consciousness and shared moral responsibility. Yet Dr. Blackthorne's growing unease suggested that this achievement represented not the culmination of human social development, but something far more troubling that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and individual consciousness. The implications of the community's transformation extended far beyond their isolated valley, suggesting possibilities for human psychological manipulation that threatened the foundations of individual autonomy and moral responsibility. Professor Cartwright's investigation into the fate of Dr. Blackthorne and the community reached its conclusion through a series of discoveries that raised more questions than they answered. The final documents in the manila envelope consisted of incomplete medical records, hastily written notes, and what appeared to be official correspondence regarding the termination of the Millbrook Rehabilitation Center's operations in late 1948. The last coherent entry in Dr. Blackthorne's journal was dated November 15, 1948, exactly 9 months after patient Zero's arrival in the community. The entry consisted of fragmented observations that suggested the doctor's own psychological state had deteriorated significantly. His handwriting, previously meticulous and controlled, had become erratic and difficult to decipher. The content revealed a man struggling to maintain scientific objectivity while experiencing phenomena that challenged his fundamental understanding of human consciousness. According to the fragmentary official records, the Millbrook facility was closed following what was described as administrative irregularities and concerns regarding patient welfare. The closure order, signed by state medical authorities, cited violations of established therapeutic protocols and unauthorized experimental procedures. However, the specific nature of these violations was never detailed in the surviving documentation. The community itself appeared to have vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Property records from the Vermont State Archives showed no trace of the settlement described in Dr. Blackthorne's reports. The geographical coordinates referenced in the medical files led to uninhabited wilderness that showed no evidence of recent human habitation. Aerial surveys conducted in the 1950s revealed no structures, cleared land, or other indicators of the substantial community that had supposedly existed in the area. Patient Zero's ultimate fate remained equally mysterious. The transfer records that had documented her arrival at Millbrook contain no corresponding documentation of her departure or relocation. Her original identity, carefully obscured throughout the medical files, could not be verified through any official channels. The military medical records that had provided crucial context for her condition were classified beyond Professor Cartwright's security clearance, effectively preventing further investigation into her background. The surviving members of Dr. Blackthorne's research team, when located and interviewed decades later, displayed remarkable consistency in their inability to recall specific details about the Millbrook facility or its operations. Their testimonies suggested genuine memory gaps rather than deliberate concealment, as if their recollections of the period had been systematically erased or suppressed. Several former staff members reported persistent dreams involving collective gatherings and ritualistic activities, but these memories lacked the coherence necessary for meaningful analysis. Professor Cartwright's attempts to verify the existence of the community through external sources proved equally fruitless. Church records, census data, and commercial transactions that should have documented the settlement's existence were conspicuously absent from historical archives. The isolation that had facilitated the community's transformation appeared to have extended to complete erasure of their historical footprint. The psychological techniques described in Dr. Blackthorne's documentation bore disturbing similarities to experimental programs that were known to have been conducted by various government agencies during the post-war period. However, official acknowledgement of such programs remained classified, preventing verification of potential connections between Patient Zero's conditioning and broader research initiatives into human behavioral modification. The implications of the documented events extended far beyond the immediate mystery of the vanished community. Dr. Blackthorne's observations suggested possibilities for rapid and comprehensive psychological transformation that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The techniques described in his reports indicated methods for eliminating individual moral autonomy while maintaining the appearance of voluntary participation. Professor Cartwright's final analysis concluded that the documents represented either an elaborate fictional construction or evidence of experimental procedures that exceeded the boundaries of ethical medical practice. The sophistication of the psychological manipulation described in the reports suggested access to advanced behavioral modification techniques that were not widely available in the 1940s. The mystery of the 1948 community remained unsolved, existing only in the fragmentary documentation that had somehow survived the systematic erasure of all other evidence. The manila envelope that had initiated Professor Cartwright's investigation bore no identifying marks that might reveal its source, leaving him to wonder whether the documents represented historical truth or elaborate fiction designed to conceal even more disturbing realities. The case stood as a testament to the fragility of individual consciousness and the potential for human psychological manipulation under specific conditions, while raising profound questions about the nature of moral autonomy and collective responsibility that remained unanswered. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.